Once you have decided to move beyond simply supplementing your cannabis substrate with bottled synthetics and you find your way to living soils, things can get pretty messy. Compost, wildcrafted nutrient teas, and fermentations all have smells that are very, potent, shall we say. I wouldn't say that many of them stink, but they do smell intense, exceptionally strange, and very wildly alive. Working with organic and living inputs is a strong reminder that life begets life. It is in that spirit that I offer today's episode entitled Dead Bodies and Poop. If you want to learn more about cannabis health, business, and technique efficiently and with good cheer, I encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter. Every week, you'll receive a new podcast episode delivered right to your inbox, along with commentary on a couple of the most important news items from the week and videos, too. Don't rely on social media to let you know when a new episode is published. Sign up for the updates to make sure you don't miss an episode. You're listening to Shaping Fire, and I'm your host, Shango Los. My guest this week is Tad Hussey. Tad is a living soils educator and owner of Keep It Simple Organics. KIS Organics is an edible nursery, production greenhouse, outdoor preschool, organic hydro shop, and online living soil inputs seller based in Redmond, Washington. Tad is also host of the Cannabis Cultivation and Science podcast. Tad's a sought-after speaker on every facet of living soils, and we're thrilled to have him here today to talk about animal inputs, from bones and blood to poop and flesh. One last note. This week's episode simply does not sound as good as our episodes usually do. When setting up for the interview, I missed that my side of the conversation was being recorded by my laptop microphone and not my fancy studio microphone. So there's a lot more echo than usual. It's tolerable. It's very tolerable. But if this is your first time listening to Shaping Fire, I don't want you to think that this is how it normally sounds. Luckily, Tad does most of the talking during the episode, and his microphone sounds just fine. So thanks for listening and enjoy the show. Hey, welcome to the show, Tad.
Oh, man, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you could peel off some time for us. So let's get right into it. We're going to be talking about a lot of animal inputs that can be used when growing cannabis or anything today. But you have taught me that one of the important things is to always start with a soil test. So even though this is not a soil test show, would you just give a quick summary of why people should have their soil looked at so they understand what they're starting with?
Yeah, I appreciate you giving me a minute to talk about this because I think it's really important. One thing I want to make clear is that there's different types of soil tests, and they all give slightly different results. There's Mehlich-3 tests, Bray-Olson, a bunch of different types of tests. And so whatever test you go with, you need to keep testing with the same lab in order to get consistent results. But this is really the foundation that allows you to use a lot of these different nutrients appropriately. Because if you know what's in your soil, then you can amend that soil to make up for any deficiencies or excesses. So I think soil testing is really important. The one that we like the best is Logan Labs standard soil test. It's like $25, so it's not terribly expensive, and that'll tell you everything that's in the soil, including your trace minerals.
Right on, cool. And so based on the results from that, you'll know what you need to do to bring your soil into the range you want it to be in for whatever you happen to be growing.
Yeah, they'll help you with interpretation, and if they can't do that, I'm available, or there's other people in the industry that can, help you understand those tests, and then you can use that information to utilize some of the other things that we're going to talk about today.
Right on, cool. The other thing while I've got you here, I want to ask you is one of the questions I get asked a lot. People ask me what the three numbers, the NPK percentages on the front of nutrients mean. Why don't you go ahead and field that question for folks who may be listening to the show new to fertilizers?
Sure. Well, I think you kind of said it there. So those three numbers, yes, those are your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium percentages, and those are required. They're state law here in Washington, Oregon, or whatever state you're in, and those numbers will tell you what percentage of that nutrient is going to be guaranteed in that product. Now, you have to be a little bit careful in the cannabis industry because if they put 555 on the label, that means there's at least 5%. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but there could be more. So with the things that we're going to talk about today, things like these different animal manures and meals, they tend to be not overinflated. But in the cannabis industry, you have to be careful because someone may say, my proprietary nitrogen source is better than another one that's also 555, well, it could be because they're putting in excess. Those numbers just give you the minimums that's required, and that's what the state tests for.
Yeah, right on. Good. That's a good point. So I want to thank you, too, for being willing to come on a show called Dead Bodies and Poop. I think that I've been thinking about these kind of nutrients for a long time. I've been thinking about it as, the animals give everything so that we can grow our cannabis in these examples. And, some of the things, like especially the feces and stuff, the animal gives off. But some of these things, like our first example, insect frass, it's everything. So insect frass is something that was new to me just this summer, and I used it for the first time, and I saw incredible results. So why don't we start there? Why don't you tell us about insect frass?
Yeah, it's something that's relatively new to the industry too, and something that I didn't know a lot about 5 years ago. But yeah, essentially the frass is the waste or excess of what's left over in the process. For example, the source that we have is up in Canada, and they're growing out black soldier flies. And black soldier flies, they don't have mouths. The larvae will eat just about anything. And then what is left over in that process, they're calling the frass after everything that the insect has eaten. So think of it like insect compost, more or less. But the great thing about it is you're getting that NPK, you're getting calcium, magnesium. It's a slower release source of these nutrients, and it's really high in chitin. And people talk about chitin as something that's really important because it's related to, there's some research that shows it supports systemic acquired resistance, or SAR, which is shown to help reduce or suppress certain pests or fungal pathogens. It's a specific enzyme that is created by these bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms that are specific for breaking down the chitin that you would see in insect frass, in crab or crustacean meal, things with shells.
Right on. So the idea of the insect frass, I picture it as just being a bunch of dried up soldier fly carcasses that are then put through a grinder and comes out as a powder. Is that a good picture of that? And do they choose soldier flies because they particularly have got these healthy nutrients in their bodies? Or is insect frass made out of any insect?
Technically, it's any insect. I've only worked with the black soldier fly frass, but the frass is really, think of it like with earthworm castings. It's the leftover casting or the poop, more or less, or the compost that's not been consumed by the insect itself. So you will get some dead bodies and things like that in there, but in general, what they do is the larvae is harvested, and that is then sold as grubs or as a fertilizer to the industry, separate from the frass itself.
Interesting. So I guess my expectation is actually not accurate. It's not like adult soldier fly body parts. It's their poop, and then also anything that's left over from the larval process. So I don't know, extra shells and mucuses and random stuff, like whatever's left in the bin. Then, man, what a weird product.
It is, but the crazy thing about it, for example, the source that we use, my buddy up at Whistler Medical Marijuana Facility, he sent it off to his friend in Quebec who runs a laboratory, and they tested it and found that, and I haven't had a chance to play with it myself yet, but they tested it and said it came back with a higher microbial charge even than worm castings. So there's a lot of good beneficial microorganisms in it, and that's one of the other things that you have to consider when using a product like this. Is not only are you getting, the NPK and the micro and macronutrients, but you're also getting this wonderful, diversity of microorganisms.
Right on. That makes a lot of sense. I can tell you one thing. I mean, adding the insect frass was the only major difference in my last crop, and the depth of green in my plants was unlike anything that I had acquired up to that point. And I actually give a lot of that up to the insect frass. Actually, I bought your insect frass. I bought it from you at the KIS store. So yeah. So anyway, so that stuff's pretty good. So one thing I want to point out to people when working with insect frass is that it's really powdery. It gets taken up into the air quickly, like perlite does. And so you either want to handle the stuff really gently or wear a mask, because you can get that stuff and inhale it easily, and that's gross.
That's a really good point. A lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today probably should be used with a mask in general, just to avoid particulate in your lungs at the very least, even if it's not something terribly gross. So that's a really good point.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So, all right, cool. So let's move on from insect frass to another one of my favorites, worm castings. And so, it's worm castings is such an elegant way to say poop, right? Because it casts off what it doesn't need anymore. So tell us a bit about worm castings.
Worm castings they're the greatest. For an organic gardener, they're probably my number one tool. And the thing about worm casting to consider is they're not all created equal. So like you mentioned, worm castings are essentially worm poop. They're usually coming out of commercial facilities, or people will have their own vermicomposting bins. And the more the worms process that material that's put into the bin, the better. But there's going to be a difference between worm castings made from, say, finished compost versus ones made from food scraps, for example. So knowing what went into the worm castings, I think, will help a lot in determining the quality of them, as well as how long the worms have worked that material. And I know for us, like, we took some of that Ole Mountain fish compost in these giant 400-gallon smart pots, and then we put worms in there, and then added some basalt and some calcium sources and some neem cake and a few other ingredients in there, and then let the worms work it for over a year. And by the time it was done, we had a really great worm casting product we were able to use.
Right on. That's good. So do they normally say on the bags the source of what the worms were eating so that you can judge the quality, or do lower quality ones not mention anything, but the really good stuff says, or all organic finished compost fed or something like that?
They don't. It's not a very good industry in that regard. It's not standardized. What you can do on your own to do your own due diligence is you can call the company and find out what they're feeding their worms, what they're bedding their worms in. And then when you look at the worm castings, and this is going to vary based on the type of worms, like African worms, for example, have really big poop. And so it's really easy to see, versus things like red wigglers have much smaller poop. But what you're looking for when you're evaluating worm castings visually is it should be a bunch of tiny little dots. If it looks like regular compost, there's a bunch of other woody materials and things in there, then that compost just really isn't mostly castings at that point. Whereas it should just look like a bunch of little tiny brown or black dots. Well,
what I was going to ask you next is that when you're looking at it, sometimes when I'll buy it, it looks like a bunch of little pellets, and sometimes it looks like a really dark compost. And I was going to ask you how you get the castings out of the compost to sell it, but what I'm realizing is what you're telling me is that they don't remove the castings from the compost. The question is, how long have they had the worms work that compost so that the percentage of castings in the compost number is really high?
Yeah, they'll put it through a variety of filters or sifts, essentially, that will remove the larger particulate. But you got to keep in mind, a lot of the worm castings that are being sold, the worms aren't being used specifically for making castings, but rather for making more worms that they can then sell the worms to, gardeners, or sell them to, fishermen and things like that. So knowing what the facility is really set up for can help determine sometimes the quality of the worm castings. But everyone should have their own worm bin. They're super easy. They're very affordable. You can even just use horse manure as an initial bedding, which is really easy to find locally. So growing your own worms is a great option for most growers. Yeah,
totally. That's a great idea. And especially if you're new to probiotic growing, it is an easy entryway into starting to play around with this stuff that won't cost you a lot of money and actually gives you something that's really valuable for both your cannabis and your food garden. So right on, cool. So we're going to take our first short break and be right back. You're listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest today is Tad Hussey of Keep It Simple Organics. If you grow cannabis with sunshine, you can often feel limited by the seasonal cycle. You want to grow sustainably and save money, so you use as little electricity as possible. But if you haven't studied or implemented light deprivation techniques into your greenhouse, you're leaving a lot of money on the table. By incorporating light deprivation solutions into your greenhouse, you can often add 2 or 3 additional growing cycles to your year. When you pencil out the financial benefit of those additional cycles, you'll realize why commercial-scale light deprivation technology is remaking the cannabis industry. What used to be done by pulling tarps over hoop houses has been scaled up over the last few years in such a way that it's become mechanized, easy, and affordable to even small-scale commercial cannabis operations. Forever Flowering Greenhouses is the industry leader in light deprivation, greenhouse design, and operation for the commercial cannabis industry. Their team of greenhouse experts have been in the fields of Northern California for decades, and they're now building greenhouses for commercial cannabis companies across the country. If you are new to light dep and growing in greenhouses, I encourage you to go back to Shaping Fire episode 13 with guest Eric Branstad of Forever Flowering. I talk with Eric about the importance of intelligent greenhouse management as well as the huge financial benefit of incorporating light dep techniques. There are so many aspects of utilizing a greenhouse that can go wrong. From temperature and airflow to light dep and workflow, Forever Flowering will help you produce crop after crop of well cared for flowers. They can help you retrofit your existing greenhouse with light dep and other modern systems at a level that fits your budget. If you're just starting out, Forever Flowering can help you plan and build your new greenhouse so that you get started on the right foot. The cannabis business has enough risks without trying to go it alone with your greenhouse. Contact Forever Flowering Greenhouses to partner with folks who have an indisputable reputation as knowledgeable and easy to work with. Go to shapingfire.com/FFG to find out more. While I certainly still enjoy smoking joints, I moved over to using vaporizers about 3 years ago. The high was a little different than burning the flower, and in the end I decided I preferred it for daily use, especially because I have asthma. More importantly though, I could taste my flower so much more. It's hard to express to you how significantly different cannabis with a good terpene profile tastes when vaped instead of burned. I have brought my vape with me to visit growers, and they are astonished by the clarity of taste, and they say they feel like they're tasting their flower for the very first time. The Air Vape Vaporizer from airvapeusa.com is a great device to use on the go or at home. When you pick it up, it feels satisfying like a medical device. It isn't flimsy like many vapes are. I like how the flower is inserted in the top instead of the bottom, so it travels a shorter path to my mouth. With the cannabis at the top, I get a hit that feels more substantial, even though I'm just inhaling vapor and not full-bodied smoke. Since I use this vape for flower, hash, and concentrates, I really like that the digital control for the temperature is right there on the front. 3 clicks of the button and it fires up to the temperature I specify really quickly and discreetly. Vape concentrates are a milder experience than dabbing, but you still get the potency in your hit. Also, the taste is great, as would be expected with a low-temp dab. I love that this vape gives quick little vibrations when it gets to the right temperature. That way, if I'm chatting or distracted while it's heating up, it lets me know when it's ready. If you are ready for a nice pocket-sized vaporizer, consider the Air Vape. The new Air Vape X has just come out, and it's gorgeous and it includes many updates. You can find more about the Air Vape Vaporizer at airvapeusa.com. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I'm your host, Shango Los, and our guest this week is Tad Hussey of Keep It Simple Organics. So during the first set, we talked about soil tests and NPK percentages, insect frass, and worm castings. And here during set 2, we're going to move more towards the seaside. So the first thing I want to talk about is crab and oyster shell. And so there are subsections of both, but can you kind of explain just generally, Tad, why we like shells to begin with?
Well, they're very different products. So when we're talking about like crab or crustacean meal, we're talking about something that's going to be high in calcium, but also going to give you some slow release nitrogen. And again, that chitin, the same thing we found in the insect frass, which we already kind of covered. But it's about 4% nitrogen, 1% phosphorus in general. And it's a really good way to get that slow release nitrogen and also encourage that chitinase specific bacteria and fungi.
Right on. So is there a real difference between the crushed shell? Because I've seen it in bags and it's just shell bits versus I've also seen people sell flour, and I'm assuming we're not baking bread with it. So why does it come in these two different forms?
Yeah, and this is a good thing to be aware of across all of these different products and meals, and just in general when you're adding things into your soil, is really the difference between and we haven't talked about oyster shell yet, but oyster shell flour versus actual oyster shells, it's really the surface area. So that oyster shell flour is going to be broken down much faster and be more available to the plant sooner than the actual oyster shell. So if you, for example, And oyster shells are calcium. That's something I meant to mention. So if you want something to be available over a period of a series of months, then you would want to use the oyster shells, whereas the oyster shell flour will still take some time to become available, but it will be much faster because there's a greater surface area for these bacteria and microorganisms to start breaking it down.
Wow, that's a really great idea. So getting the crushed shell pieces is more of a time release kind of nutrient, whereas the flour is going to be instantly and fully available. That's really cool. So when choosing between crab and oyster shell, what do you teach people, how to come to their decision on which to go with?
Well, I just want to touch on one thing, just to be really clear. The calcium in general takes a while to become available when added in these forms. So when I say more available, we're still talking weeks to months in general with calcium. But that being said, if you're looking for a slow release nitrogen source, then that crab crustacean meal is really great. If you're looking for just calcium, then you could use something like oyster shell. Well,
all right, but you would get the calcium with the crustacean shell too, right? So why wouldn't everybody just go with crustacean shell? Is there something special that's unique about oyster shell that you can't get from the crab shell?
No, not really. You could. The thing with the crab shell, though, is you are getting 4% nitrogen, so you would end up with more nitrogen relative to the amount of calcium you needed.
I see.
And one thing to mention is oyster shell is primarily just calcium carbonate, and it's a lot easier to get that calcium directly from agricultural lime. They're both mined products, but you can go down and buy a bag of agricultural lime at your local feed store or your any kind of garden center, and it might be $8 to $10 for a 50-pound bag, so really affordable. Whereas that oyster shell flour may cost you $15 to $25 a bag. So there are more affordable sources for gardeners and farmers on the calcium side than necessarily using oyster shell flour.
Right on. And this will probably come up a couple times today, but is there such thing as, sustainably harvested crab and oyster shell products versus unsustainably farmed? Is this something that we need to be aware of when buying it, or are there just so much leftovers of that from the other industries that it's just stuff that would otherwise get thrown away?
That's a really good question. I haven't looked into the crab crustacean meal processing enough. I do know it is leftover byproduct of that, the fishing and seafood industry. In terms of the oyster shell flour, I know it's a mined product, just like agricultural lime. They're mining these old ocean beds that are now on land. So they're not any more sustainable than the agricultural lime. So to me, there's not a huge advantage to using oyster shell flour over other lime sources. They're all mined products.
Yeah, right on. So when doing research for this show, I came across a variety that I've never actually heard before, fossil shell flour. And, I'm actually excited to find out what this is, because I imagine that, you deep in the earth and you've got some animal that died near the beach, and then years of compression, and now you've got a fossil, and somehow they dig this out. What's the story with this?
You've probably already seen it on shelves and heard of it under the name diatomaceous earth.
Oh, yeah, I have.
Yeah, they're essentially the same thing. It's just a legal term. But really, the diatomaceous earth, the cool thing about it is 33% silica, 19% calcium. It's got some of these trace minerals in it. So it has some beneficial nutrients and things for your plant. One thing to keep in mind, though, is even though it's so high in silica, only about 0.25% is actually in a plant available form. So you're not really getting that high dose of silica that you could from other sources. But it also works as a natural desiccant, as I understand it. So when you put it on an insect or use it to top dress your soil, and the insects walk through it, it creates little microcuts because of these tiny diatoms, and that will eventually cause them to dehydrate. I've heard a couple different stories in terms of the process, but how it works, but that's the one that most people tell me. But it is an effective pesticide in that regard. But once you water it, so for example, when you top dress with it, it's no longer as effective. But yeah, it has a couple different uses.
Yeah, I know people who use it for that cutting ability when they're fighting soil gnats, because I guess moving around that stuff cuts off their body. Would that have the same thing to do for us? Should we be using gloves when handling diatomaceous earth?
I'm not so concerned about your skin, but in general, you want to wear a respirator, especially. And then I made the mistake of one time using it for mites and gnats and not wearing eye protection. So actually, when I was done, my eyes were super bloodshot, and it was kind of like this "oh duh" moment after I was finished. But at the time, it didn't even occur to me. So yeah, you got to protect yourself when using these things.
Man, that sounds really uncomfortable. That blows back into your face. Now it's in your eyes, and it's all these micro cuts on your. That doesn't sound good at all. So, what would somebody use diatomaceous earth for? What's its target usage other than a protectant on the top? Is it also a heavy nitrogen fixer?
I'm not seeing a lot of people using it as a particular fertilizer so much as you'll see it in the pet industry for dealing with, organic flea solution or powder. Mm-hmm. You'll also see it for dealing with mites and gnats and things like that. But it does add some of these things, especially that silica that will slowly break down over time and the calcium. So, people are starting to use it more and more in their soils.
Right on. So one last thing on this. So if it's fossil shell, how actually is it made? Is it really compressed shells along the seashore that they go and they mine because it's got 10,000 years of compounded shells in it? Is that really what it is, or is the name a misnomer?
No, you're right. It's these diatoms or tiny shells that were left on these ocean beds from, I'm guessing thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years old now, that are now on land and mined. So these are mined products still that we're talking about, unfortunately.
Right on. So let's move on to actual fish. So there's a lot of different ways that I've seen people work with fish. I've seen, fish emulsions and meal and fish bone and fish compost. And I even saw this old guy here on Vashon Island who just took the fish guts from his salmon fishing and just chucked them in the hole that he was about to plant his cannabis plant in and just threw them in there raw. And I'm like, oh man, I'm not sure if you should age that first or do something. But he said that's how he's been doing it for 20 years and he grows great flowers. So I'm not going to complain, but it was weird to see like just the whole carcass is put in there. So let's start with that. Can you just as simply throw fish trailings into the hole where you're going to plant? Or in almost all cases, do you want to process that fish somehow so it's not just rotting underground?
That's an old school gardening move, actually. It's been around for a long time. In fact, I think it dates back to a Native American culture originally. So yeah, a lot of people will do that. I've never personally done that, but I do use a lot of fish products, both in our soils and in my own gardening for a variety of reasons. Yeah.
Right on. So what's a fish emulsion? I hear that term thrown around a lot.
Yeah, in general, when you see fish fertilizer that's a liquid, it comes in two forms. It's either going to be fish emulsion or fish hydrolysate. And the emulsion, the big difference is the emulsion uses a heat process. So that material is heated up, which can destroy some of the enzymatic qualities of the final product. In general, fish emulsion tends to be a little bit stinkier than fish hydrolysate as well, but it is going to have a higher nitrogen content. Now, fish hydrolysate, on the other hand, uses cold water processing and typically specific enzymes that break down all the leftover fish bits and carcasses. And then for some silly reason with bureaucracy, you're allowed to stabilize it with phosphoric acid and still have it be considered organic. So you do have a higher phosphorus content than you would in the fish emulsion. So the quick way to tell really quickly, just staring at two fish products, is if it has a higher phosphorus than nitrogen, it's probably hydrolysate. If it has a high nitrogen and no phosphorus, it's probably emulsion. And both come in deodorized or less stinky versions. So using these fish products, they're still going to smell like fish a little bit, but they're not going to be terrible. And one thing that's really important to mention is that fish hydrolysate is actually a really, really good microbial food specifically for fungus. So it will grow great fungal hyphae and compost teas and also help promote them in your soil.
Right on. So moving along to fish meal, then is that just simply fish ground up?
Yeah, as far as I understand, it's literally ground fish, leftover ones that they couldn't use for, up processing.
So it's kind of sounds like the old school version of just chucking the fish in the ground, but in a shelf stable package.
Yeah, they do have to stabilize it. It's literally like a brown powder. It's not terribly stinky. None of the powders are nearly as smelly as the liquids in general. But the great thing about fish meal is it's 10-4-0, and it's a fast release nitrogen source, relatively speaking, compared to other nitrogen sources out there.
So really what we're talking about by comparing these different fish products is not really the same product in 4 different packages. We're really talking about, the emulsions versus the, how do you say it, hydrostate?
I say hydrolysate.
Hydrolysate.
I've also heard hydrolysate. I'm not sure what the
right on.
the technical correct pronunciation
the
is.
Fish
there.
Emulsion versus the hydro. That seems to be, what NPK you want. And then the fish meal takes that and adds the additional variable of how quickly you want it available to the plant. So even though these are all fish-based, really it sounds like the nature of the processing has a lot to do with which product you end up choosing. And the last one on my list is fish compost, which it's an interesting idea because the compost that we have where I live, I've been told not to put any animal products in it. So what's the story with fish compost?
You don't see a lot of it. We work with one company here in Washington that makes a fish compost, and I think what's so great about that product is the fact they let it age for at least 2 years before they sell it. So to me, it's not so much the fact they're using fish, which is great, but the fact that they allow that material to be fully composted through static composting. You just can't beat nature in that regard. But yeah, it's a great product. We find it comes in with a lot of really good beneficial micro and macro invertebrates. And, it's going to be a little bit higher in nitrogen than some of the other, strictly food waste or, plant waste compost. But one thing I wanted to mention that I forgot to was in regards to fish hydrolysate, that is sort of my go-to bottled nutrient. If you want a just very simple bloom nutrient, fish hydrolysate could replace, I think, a lot of the bloom nutrients out there on the market as just a swap for a quarter of the price.
Right on. That's fantastic. You mentioned earlier too that the liquids tend to smell fishier, and for me, I would consider that a win. I mean, if it smells fishy, I'm thinking it's got more of the active life force, if you will, of the original fish than some of the overly processed powders, which have lost that smell. I'm thinking that the liquids are just going to hold more of the essential oils of the fish throughout the process. I'm not sure if I'm right, but that's certainly how I would go when I was buying it.
You do get higher oil content, which is great. But the one thing I noticed that reminded me of the fact I tested this like freeze-dried or flash-dried fish powder that was carried in a local garden center. And I was looking at it under the microscope by using it as a food source for soil microbes. And I found that I did not get very good results. So it's amazing how different of a microbial food, for example, the fish hydrolysate is than the fish emulsion or the fish meal or even this freeze-dried product. They can really vary across the board. So in general, fish hydrolysate is sort of my go-to for liquid. And then if I want nitrogen, I'll go with fish meal. If I want calcium, you can use something like phosphorus, then you can use fish bone meal, which is another fish product while we're on the topic.
So they remove all the fleshy bits of the fish and they just go with the bone. Is that so you make a more targeted nutrient?
Again, I think it's a byproduct they were able to make into a fertilizer. Yeah. But if you don't want to use land animal or mammal-based phosphorus sources, then the fish bone meal is a really good option. I only know of one other non-animal-based phosphorus source, which would be soft rock phosphate, but that has its own challenges. So fish bone meal to me is really one of the best phosphorus options out there for gardeners and growers beyond compost.
Right on, great. So before we leave the seaside and move inland again, let's talk about some guanos. So people have been using bat guano for decades, And at least in my world, seabird guano is something that seems to have come more recently. Can you first speak to why people like using these seaside guanos to begin with, and then what the difference is between the bat and the seabird guano?
Yeah, so people have been using guanos for years now. You hear a lot of old school growers that talk about how the guano is what separates their bud from, everyone else's. And guanos are great because they're good, fast release sources of a lot of these micro and macronutrients. It's one of the great examples, too, of why a soil test is so helpful, because they come in a variety of different NPK values depending on where they're sourced from. So you may see like Peruvian seabird guano that has 10% phosphorus, for example, whereas a Mexican bat guano or seabird guano may be 10% nitrogen and no phosphorus. So depending on what habitats coming out can really determine the nutrient content. So the guanos will vary across the board in that regard. Now, I'm personally not a huge fan of guanos, and I'll share why. In general, it's not a rapidly renewable resource. These caves lose their biodiversity when they're harvested, and that can destroy some of the ecology in the caves. And also, if it's harvested when the bats are present, the bats may not want to return back to that cave to care for their young, or they may abandon that cave altogether. And even though it's a source of economy for a lot of these local and indigenous populations, it can cause a lot of respiratory health problems and other things for the people actually doing the collection. Now, before people get super mad at me, I will say there are safe and sustainably harvested ways of doing that process, but it's impossible to know when you go pick up a bag on the shelf how that stuff has been processed without calling the manufacturer and really doing a lot of research on it.
So it sounds like guano is one of those things that we really want to know our producer, because we want to know, where and how it was produced, but then also we want to know what the makeup of it is, because it sounds like guanos are not, you can't just swap them out one for the other. Each one is going to be kind of its own product.
Yeah, and the other thing to think about, too, is the microbial aspect of bat guanos or seabird guanos. So some people swear that the reason they love these guanos is because they bring in specific microbes that are really good for bringing out all the, the terpenes in your final bud. That being said, you also have the potential for pathogens like E. coli or Salmonella. There's a specific one to bats called histoplasmosis. That's a fungal spore that is pretty nasty that you don't want to get. And, you had asked me before the show about guanos, and one of the questions you asked was, are there any requirements around microbial testing, like for these pathogens? So I called the Department of Agriculture in Oregon and was talking to the guy, and he said that they don't actually have any requirements for that to register guano as a fertilizer. But there may be some in terms of with the USDA in terms of what they allow you to legally import. I haven't looked into it that far, but be aware with these guano products, you could be bringing in some, potentially dangerous pathogens as well.
Right on. I remember, so I had Kevin Jodry from Wonderland Nursery, Humboldt County, up here to do a talk a few months back during the summer, all on how to breed for terpenes. And he said that one of the things that you have to be really careful about with guano is how much it influences the terpene profile. Yes, it'll turn up your terpenes, but it only turns up a particular spectrum of terpenes. And he says that he remembers way back, I think he said it was in the early 90s, but yestertime anyway, when bat guano became really popular in Humboldt. And then suddenly and oddly, people's cannabis flowers started tasting very similar. And people were like, I wonder if that's because we've all started using guano. And then the overseas manufacturer for the bulk of the guano that was coming to the United States changed. And they changed where they were getting it from. And then suddenly in one season, all these terpene profiles all changed at the same time. And they all realized how much using guano was encouraging certain terpenes and discouraging other terpenes. And so for him, he's all like, I don't really want anything in my fertilizers that's going to artificially, air quotes, change the plant. He says, because I want to taste the full spectrum of the plant. So So Kevin went on with things that he has found that can be used as a as a nutrient, but that wasn't going to spike certain terpenes and not others, thus not having the plant properly express itself. And I found that really interesting, both the fact of adding products like Terpinator that does that will turn up a certain spectrum of terpenes while not doing the others, but also the influence on agriculture as a whole. As agriculture changes from one nutrient being invoked to another, it will really impact the agricultural product, whatever it is.
Yeah, and I think from an ethical perspective, at the very least, if we're talking about importing these things, they have a massive fossil fuel cost just to get them to the United States. I think that we can find a lot of these same nutrients in other sources, some of which we've already talked about. I know we're going to talk about some other options too. So I think there's replacements for bat guanos and seabird guanos out there that we can find more locally. And I think also a lot of the reason that you're getting these terpene changes is due to the high sulfur levels that you're seeing in bat guanos. There's a big link between sulfur and terpenes. It's already been established. So that's something I think you can play with yourself as a grower if you're doing soil testing, is you can experiment with different sulfur levels in your soils and see how that expression changes your final flower.
Right on. So we're going to take another short break and be right back. You're listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest today is Tad Hussey of Keep It Simple Organics. As a listener of Shaping Fire, you already understand the importance of living soil when growing cannabis. When you have active microbe communities in your substrate, you go way beyond simply fertilizing with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Having active microorganisms in your substrate supports vigorous plant growth throughout the plant's root zone, making for higher yields and thriving flowers. Mammoth P is the first organically derived microbial inoculant that focuses on your plant's nutrient cycling processes to release soil phosphorus and other micronutrients from their bound forms, making them more available to the plant. Increased levels of phosphorus will also keep internodes shorter and focus your plant's energy on bud production. Not only that, but the microbes act as a defense shield for the plant's rhizosphere by outcompeting potentially harmful pathogenic microbes. Pretty cool, right? Mammoth P not only unlocks the nutrients in your soil, but it also helps protect your plant from disease. Mammoth P's beneficial bacteria act like microbioreactors, continually producing enzymes that release nutrients. Mammoth P was developed at a U.S. university and has been extensively tested by Colorado growers and independent laboratories. Mammoth P is proven to increase growth and enhance blooming. One of the great things about supplementing with microorganisms is that they won't compete with whatever fertilizer program you're already running. Simply dose on top of your fertilizer schedule for increased benefits. To learn more and to find out where you can buy Mammoth P near you, check out their website at www.mammothmicrobes.com. Partner with microorganisms to create beautiful, thriving cannabis. Mammoth P. Now that the health benefits of terpenes have become well known in the cannabis industry, people everywhere are looking for the purest terpenes without adulterants. The problem with most terpene providers is that they're not sourced naturally and instead are made as a byproduct of refining petroleum, and that's so sketchy. The terpenes sold by True Terpenes are entirely different. They are certified organic, non-GMO, and food grade. That means they are extracted from real plant sources. There are no solvents of any kind used during the extraction process. They are distilled only with steam. That's right, only steam. In fact, terpenes from True Terpenes are so pure that you can eat them. Not only that, but you can stack them with better results too. What I mean is, other companies' terpenes have got a few % of impurities, and when you stack those terpenes to make a blend, you're adding a variety of impurities that degrade your final product. True Terpenes also has strain-specific terpenes for a wide range of cannabis strains like Durban Poison, Sunset Sherbet, and Granddaddy Purple. True Terpenes has robust and supportive customer service, so your questions will get answered fast and efficiently. If you've shopped for terps before, you know how rare that is. So whether you want to cup your hands to smell some beta-caryophyllene to calm down after getting too high, or if you want to dab some alpha-pinene so your lungs feel fabulous and your mind feels liberated, True Terpenes will provide you with a truly natural experience. If you are a cannabis product developer, these are the terps you want to add to your oil or edible or capsule or whatever. True Terpenes are simply the best your money can buy. Don't try and make a premium product with substandard terps. Choose True Terpenes for a top-shelf experience. Go to shapingfire.com/true terpenes to find out more or click on the link in this week's newsletter. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I'm your host, Shango Los, and our guest this week is Tad Hussey of Keep It Simple Organics. So let's come inland a little bit from the ocean shore, and let's talk about blood meal. Where does it come from, and what are we using it for, Tad?
Yeah, blood meal is a byproduct of the meat or slaughterhouse industry. It's literally what you think it is, and it's about 13% fast-release nitrogen. So a lot of gardeners I know will use it in veg as a way of increasing that nitrogen percentage. It's really affordable. It's kind of nasty, in my opinion. You don't want to get it wet and on your fingers, but it is like a reddish powder that you can add into your soil.
Is it simply blood that's been dehydrated?
As far as I know, yeah, it's pretty much that's pretty much all it is.
How much thread is there for it to carry pathogens?
I haven't heard of any issues around it, but honestly, I don't have a lot of growers that I know using it. It's one of those things that a lot of people have ethical issues around. But I've worked with some really good tomato growers and such that would put a small amount in with their tomato starts as a way to give them a little boost. I've
always kind of got the impression that it's kind of like an old school nutrient, especially with lower income farmers. It's something that they can afford to use, that once dried is pretty stable, and if you've already got a farm and farm animals and you're going to slaughter them for your family, this is a ready alternative, or it's readily there. Is blood meal moving more out of vogue because we've got other things that do the same work but with more benefit?
It's hard for me to say on like an agricultural level, but I just personally choose not to use it. I'll pay a little bit more to use the fish meal, and it's not all that cheap either. So it's just something that I don't personally like to use. I mean, if we're desperate for more nitrogen, there's other sources like cover crops and nitrogen fixing legumes and things like that, or fish meal that we talked about, or even alfalfa meal and some of these other plant meals will bring in a small percentage of nitrogen.
Right on. Does it matter what type of blood it is, like what animal, or is it just kind of all the same?
I haven't really delved into it. That's a good question. We get a 50-pound bag that's full of blood meal, and I haven't gone beyond that with it, honestly.
Right on. Fair enough. So while we're on the farm, let's talk about feather meal. When I first read this, I had to go to Wikipedia and look it up because I'm like, is it really feathers? And it appears to be yes.
Yep. Another byproduct of the poultry industry this time. Now, the cool thing about feather meal is it's a slow release nitrogen product. So if you want nitrogen right away, blood meal is going to give you that, or fish meal. But if you want something that's going to be released over a period of months, because from an outdoor gardening perspective, nitrogen is something that's leached out of your soil every year when it rains. It doesn't stick around in the soil. So we have, as a farmer or gardener, we have to add it every year. So feather meal is great because you could put it in at the beginning of the season and it'll be available slowly over a period of months rather than all at once right at the beginning of the crop cycle.
Right on. And it's just is it chicken feathers, or is it many different types of birds?
Oh man, Shango, I don't know all these answers. I've never looked into that either.
Right on.
It's just a brown powder. You can't you wouldn't even know it was feather meal or it was made from feathers just looking at it. It has a little bit of an off odor, but it's not terribly unpleasant.
And I think the fact that you don't know as much about blood and feather meal as the other things that we've talked about that you know a ton about, I think that probably says something about the likelihood of people wanting to choose this stuff. It's like it may be low cost and may have been around for a while, but not only is it farming byproduct, which you may or may not want to use in your grow at all, but in most of these cases we've got new and better available things to use. Do you think that's a fair assumption?
Yeah, I do still like feather meal, and I will use a small amount of feather meal, but the blood meal and bone meal, I would prefer to use fish products on, and that's just a personal choice. But they're out there, and if you have a good cheap source of them, by all means, you should utilize it. The plant doesn't care.
Yeah,
Let's be clear on that.
Right on. So I live on an island, and a lot of people like to be self-sufficient and don't want to bring over things packaged. And I know a lot of people who are into probiotic are very much into being self-sufficient and brewing up their own stuff. And it doesn't take long for people to realize that, the rabbits that they keep, their poop is really great for their plants. And then they start thinking, well, maybe the straw filled with chicken poop from the chicken yard would be good for my plants too. So let's take those individually. For people who want to derive their nutrients on their own property, how good of a choice is rabbit poop and chicken poop?
Yeah, so as a general rule, I like to break out animal manures based on what that animal likes to eat. So in general, herbivores tend to be safer composts or safer manures than carnivore or omnivores. So things like rabbits and chickens, those horse, for example, those are all relatively safe. They don't tend to be, you tend to be able to use them much more readily. Like, for example, rabbit poop doesn't need to be composted. Now, in general, I like to compost all animal manures because it reduces or removes the risk of pathogens like E. coli or Salmonella. But people have been using rabbit manure raw directly on their plants for, generations now without a lot of issues. Now, one thing about chicken manure that you mentioned is chicken manure can be hot. And when they talk about a source of manure being hot, not only can that be thermally hot, as in temperature wise, because those bacteria and microorganisms are reproducing so rapidly as they break down that material, that manure. It's an exothermic reaction which generates heat. And as you may already know, like, plants do not like a lot of high temperatures around their roots. So putting that right into the soil can be damaging for the plant. In addition, when they talk about burning, the other thing that can occur is when you put a high nitrogen source out like that, the bacteria and microorganisms can be more efficient at pulling and consuming the nitrogen that is available in that soil. And so what they can do is actually pull nitrogen from that soil more efficiently than the plant, and then the plant can show nitrogen deficiencies, even though there's a lot of nitrogen in that soil.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So running that backwards, it sounds like the chicken poop would probably be best serve the gardener to rake out the yard and then compost that for a little bit, so it can cool out and be a little more stable and use it that way. And then for rabbit poop, potentially throw it on there as a top dress. And then water over it, kind of like as a time release thing. Do those both sound like reasonable ways to use those?
Definitely. And the rabbit poop is a lot easier to collect too, because the rabbits are typically living in cages with mesh bottoms so that drops through. With the chicken poop, what we do is we put all of our chickens on arborist chips, which is essentially large wood chips. So they're really, really high in carbon, so which balances out the high nitrogen, relatively speaking, of the chicken poop. So that will compost right there. It's called a deep litter method for chicken owners, and that will slowly break down. And then after a period of time, we'll remove that sort of composted material and let it compost further before bringing it back in as a fertilizer or nutrient.
Right on, the deep litter method. That's really great. Thank you for that, Tad. Right on. So, Tad, while we've got you here, we might as well talk about human manure too. Some people do use human feces with their plants, and, that grosses out a lot of people, but a lot of the people who use it swear by it. So what say you? I got to say it grosses me out a little bit too. I have no problems with human manure. I just don't like to use it on my edible plants, and I would throw cannabis in that category. Yeah, I got to say there's a funny story. There was this guy on IC Mag a while back that would post all of his food. He was like, I had a hemp smoothie for lunch, and then he would show his plant growing, and it was the saddest looking plant. But it was so funny, all the comments on that thread. It was a good kick. But honestly, I personally choose not to use
human manure just because of the higher risk of E. coli and some of these other pathogens like salmonella, in all seriousness. So people can do it. Just fully compost the material. That means you're heating it to 131 degrees for at least 3 days. You're turning the pile. It requires a lot more work to really remove those pathogens.
Right on. We'll leave that for the strictly hardcore experimenters. So we've talked about a lot of the easy inputs today, and one way or another, they're all feeding our NPK and very possibly also our microbe communities. A lot of people like to stick with just using plant inputs. Is there anything in this list today that we can't replace with some other plant?
I wouldn't say there's anything that's irreplaceable. I do like to use some animal and fish products just because it's a lot easier to get these, especially the macronutrients, the nitrogen and phosphorus specifically, in high levels. But you are able to pick them up from plant sources. Now, I don't like to take it as far as the veganics guys. An animal will be walking in the woods and die in nature, and then that animal will be consumed by microorganisms and break back down into the soil. And to me, that's a perfectly natural process. And I think it's an important process that we need to recognize. So to me, animal byproducts are not bad. You just need to look into your sourcing of them when you're choosing to use them.
Yeah, right on. And this summer is the first year that I got into this stuff at all. And I decided I just wanted to start simple. So I started with insect frass, worm castings, and a liquid fish product. And I was really happy with the results. And I think that it's an easy way for people to get into it without thinking that they have to have all of the knowledge that we went through today.
I think you started with 3 really great products too. Kelp meal would be the other one I would recommend to people, even though it doesn't fit into that poop category. But one thing I forgot to mention about worm castings is if you ever see a plant that's just a little bit unhappy, throwing a handful or 2 of worm castings in there and watering it in, a lot of times it can correct these little minor issues you may have as a new grower, and that's a great way to go.
My friend told me that worm castings is the chocolate cake of the plant nutrient world. Just like with humans, no matter what's got you down, if you have a little bit of chocolate cake, you'll feel better. That's how he feels about worm castings.
Yeah, I like that analogy. I would even say it's healthier though too. So you're not putting on anything that's going to be bad for the plant. It's going to ultimately, increase its health, unlike chocolate cake for us.
Yeah, right on. Well said. Well said. Well, Tad, thanks so much for being on this show. It's always great to be able to have a chance to talk with you and be able to leverage your experience. So thanks you so much.
Thank you. I had a great time. I really appreciate it.
You can connect with Tad at kisorganics.com. And they're on the kisorganics.com website. They've got a great web store, which has all sorts of things for living soil, composting, and things of that realm. But you can also subscribe to Tad's podcast there, which is fabulous, called Cannabis Cultivation and Science. There's a place to subscribe right there on the front page. So make sure to check that out as well.
You can find more episodes of the Shaping Fire podcast and subscribe to the show at shapingfire.com and on Apple iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. If you enjoyed the show, we'd really appreciate it if you'd leave a positive review of the podcast wherever you download. Your review will help others find the show so they can enjoy it too. On the Shaping Fire website, you can also subscribe to the weekly newsletter for insights into the latest cannabis news and product reviews. On the Shaping Fire website, you will also find transcripts of today's podcast as well. For information on me and where I will be speaking, you can check out shangolos.com. Does your company want to reach our national audience of cannabis enthusiasts? Email hotspot@shapingfire.com to find out how. Thanks for listening to Shaping Fire. I've been your host, Shango Los.